Halli Casser-Jayne, and welcome to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a podcast akin to the great salons of times past. Pour yourself a martini, grab a spot on your favorite sofa, and listen to the great artists, writers, politicians, and celebrities of our day discuss and debate the current political and economic scene, art and music, film, literature, or maybe talk about the newest trends in fashion, design, and haute cuisine. Whether it's the current political cocktail or the latest must-read award-winning book, we tackle all topics and like to stir and sometimes shake things up. I recently had the pleasure to speak with two authors whose stories I think you're going to find fascinating. Up first is Earl Swift, the author of Chesapeake Requiem, A Year with the Watermen of Vanishing Tangier Island, and Susan Hand Shatterly, the author of SEAWEED CHRONICLES, A World at the Water's Edge. Global warming, the environment, our precious resources are the focus of this episode of the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. Let's get to it. For much of the past 2 years, award-winning journalist Earl Swift lived and reported on a tiny island in Virginia. The resulting book, Chesapeake Requiem, is a portrait of an isolated community, a sweeping natural history of an extraordinary ecosystem, and a timely meditation on dire environmental realities that extend far beyond the shores of Tangier, which seems likely to succumb first among U.S. towns to the effects of climate change. First mapped by Jon Smith in 1608, settled during the Revolution, the tiny sliver of mud and marsh is home to 470 hardy people who live with one foot on the 21st century and another in times long past. They are separated from their countrymen by 12 miles of often tempestuous water that for generations has made Tangier a chief source for the prized Chesapeake Bay blue crab. 9 generations removed from the American mainstream, Tangier men speak a brogue of old words and phrases, twisted vowels, and strange rhythms, and hew to customs long abandoned on the mainland. But the very water that has long sustained Tangier now erases it day by day. Experts believe that barring heroic intervention by the federal government, islanders will soon be forced to abandon their homes. And the question remains, should the federal government save the tiny island or surrender it to the sea? After all, thousands of American communities are being swallowed up by the sea. The American government can't save them all. Let's talk to the author of Chesapeake Requiem, Earl Swift. Chesapeake Requiem, you did a wonderful job on this. The writing of it really has caught me.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So let's chat about this. Let's talk about how all this even came to be. I mean, you certainly have been writing about the Chesapeake for 30 years or so. I think I read, and I've been told you circumnavigated the bay by kayak, man of my own heart. There are 1,000 stories to be told about the Chesapeake, and why did you put your efforts to telling the story of Tangier Island? Fascinating. Tell me about that.
Well, it's a tiny speck of mud and marsh surrounded by 18 trillion gallons of water out in the widest part of the bay. And I think what resonated for me was just the notion that within 100 miles of Washington, D.C., you have what likely is the most isolated community in the East, if not the lower 48, one of the few places in America you cannot drive to, a place that really takes some effort and some stubbornness to live in. And this hardy group of cousins, basically, that one extended family has occupied this tiny outpost since 1778 and made their living by drawing from the bay. And in a terrible irony, now the very bay that they've depended on for their livelihoods for the last 240 years is threatening to consume their homeland, their home place. The bay is coming up. The land in the Chesapeake Basin is subsiding at the same time. And so you have a 1-2 punch of big global forces underway there that spell a pretty bleak prognosis for Tangier, and lacking just heroic intervention by the federal government.
Right. Talk to me about the history of this place, because they're all, first of all, they speak a different language, really. I mean, they're so isolated. But where did they come from? How did they get there? Just give us a little background on that.
Well, the first settler was a Marylander a fellow named Joseph Crockett, who moved down from Smith Island, which is a Maryland island 6 miles to the north across the state line. And he moved down there in his 50s and did so to farm. His grandchildren really were the populators of modern Tangier. His children didn't all move to Tangier, but his grandkids tended to, and they had passels of children themselves. And it wasn't long before they recognized that there was a far more bountiful harvest that waited offshore rather than in the marsh grasses in which they grazed their cattle. And so beginning in the early 19th century, Tangier became a watermen's community. The folks there oystered initially and fished. And then when the oysters began to play out in the late 19th century, really turned their attention to the blue crab. And since then, Tangier has become the quintessential crabbing community. It's a factory town, basically, with a fleet of small, shallow draft boats that go out every day to pull up crab pots. And if you enjoy crab cakes that are actually made from Chesapeake Bay blue crab, chances are there's some Tangier DNA associated with your having them on your plate. And certainly if you like soft-shell crab, there's a good chance that crab came from Tangier, because the island rightfully claims itself to be the soft-shell crab capital of the world.
Tangier, how did it get its name?
That's a very good question. Some islanders will tell you that Jon Smith named it, but there's really no evidence to support that. The name didn't start popping onto maps and into common usage until decades after his time in the Chesapeake, and no one really knows.
Interesting. So to get there, it's what you have to take a boat, obviously, and it's what 12. How far out is it from the mainland?
Well, the nearest port is Crisfield, Maryland. So if you're trying to reach this little piece of Virginia from Virginia, you have to drive 7 months of the year. You have to drive into another state to get there, to catch the mail boat out of Crisfield. In the summer, there are a number of tour boats and summer ferries that operate out of Virginia ports in Nancock, which is 16 miles away, Reedville on the western shore, which is about the same distance. And there's a tour boat that also leaves from Crisfield.
And the population at this point is what?
460, give or take.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Down from 3 times that many in the 1920s.
Unbelievable. Just unbelievable. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about, this Chesapeake Bay. It's a story in and of itself. I've been around long enough, all the incarnations. We're going to clean this mess up. Curious as to see whether or not you think they've done a good job. But this decline of the blue crab, and folks, if you haven't had Maryland or whatever crabs out of the Chesapeake, you have not lived. The figures are staggering. Talk to us about that, because the decline is rapid and horrid.
Well, it has been in years past. This year, however, is a bumper year for the blue crab. So it's not a linear descent into oblivion for the species. It ran into some very tough going 20 years back, and prompting Virginia to institute some pretty draconian measures to bring the species back. And for the most part, they appear to have worked. The state declared huge pieces of the lower bay as sanctuaries where no crabbing could take place. They froze the issuing of new crabbing licenses, which capped the number of watermen on the bay. They required watermen to get a separate license for each type of pot they put out, which hadn't been the case before. They outlawed winter crab dredging, which was not practiced by many, but was a particularly destructive practice in the eyes of conservationists. And all of these things really had their effect. And although you can't say that the crab's out of the woods completely, it has held its own pretty well. There have been some years where the bottom has fallen out and the number of crabs has been alarmingly small, but it does not appear to be the result of overfishing. It doesn't appear to be the result of poor water quality per se, although certainly the bay needs vast improvement there. There are years when I think the scientists are as stumped as anybody as to what's going on.
Now, these people who are on Tangier, who are the crabmen? or woman as it might be. Talk to me about who you live with them for a year. You really got to know these people. What makes them the great crabbers that they are? Who are these people? Maybe you want to cite one person or two. I'm just curious as hell as to people, salt of the earth, right?
Oh, yeah. For the most part. Well, let's look at one crabber, 87-year-old Leon McMahon, who is the oldest active waterman on Tangier right now. Leon was born in 1931. He has been crabbing full-time since just right about the end of World War II. And he left school, I believe he was 15 when he quit school, which was standard operating procedure for Tangier boys through the late 1970s, maybe the early 80s. Almost everyone on Tangier. You could expect that if you were in a class at the Tangier Combined School, the K through 12 school there, that in first and second grade you'd have as many boys as girls in your class. By the time 11th grade rolled around, you'd be lucky to have one boy left in the class. All the boys left school and went onto the water. They followed the water, almost always following their fathers into the business. And the reasons were plain. A crabber is his own boss. His income is largely dependent on his diligence and his willingness to put in the hours. He can be as aggressive or not as he chooses to be. And a crabber, an ambitious crabber, could easily make as much as any blue-collar worker on the mainland back in the day. And, at the time, a young man on Tangier could outfit a classic Chesapeake Bay dead rise boat with all the gear he needed for $20,000 or less, and the bank would write him a loan for the entire amount. And what you've seen happen is that's undergone a profound change. Banks aren't writing loans for boats anymore, and those boats cost $120,000 to $150,000 to outfit. And it's a very tough business to get into today. And so you don't see young people following their fathers onto the water as they did just 30 years ago. But in Leon's case, he made his living. He had 4 kids. He lived on Tangier in the middle of town, an area called Meat Soup, which no living Tangierman can explain. No one knows where that name came from. And he has his entire working life risen at 2 or 3 in the morning, hit the water hours before dawn, often closer to midnight than daybreak. And he spends the morning into the early afternoon, in his case, scraping, but he used to be a potter. He used to pull up crab pots. And then, he spends the rest of the day tending his peeler crabs. Leon is somebody who's in the soft shell business. So he goes after crabs that are about to molt and keeps them in big wooden tanks behind his crabbing shanty and holds them until they do molt and then plucks them out of the water. And if you get them out of the water and them on ice, no hard shell will form over them. They'll remain soft, and they kind of have the consistency, the snap of a good hot dog when you eat a soft shell.
Yeah, that's an acquired taste for me. What is this guy? I mean, you live on this island, you live on the water. How lucky are you? Your diet's probably pretty darn good. You're eating a lot of healthy fish and what have you. And I have this pictures of this guy. I mean, what did you say? What does he look like? I mean, is he weather beaten? Is he standing tall?
Well, I've seen pictures of Leon back in the 70s, and he was a pretty burly guy with big kind of mutton chop sideburns, and it looked like somebody you wouldn't want to mess with. And he's diminished somewhat, or in the succeeding decades, but he remains in remarkably good shape for 87 years old. Leon goes out in that boat every day, and he's got forearms on him that, they're Popeye-like. Just from hauling up pots for the first 50 years of his career and pulling a scrape for the last 20 or so. And, he's a remarkable guy. If you were to see him at church when he's wearing his Sunday best, he always wears a suit. You would have no idea that he could be a retired businessman from the mainland. you see him on his boat, then you're looking at a guy who's essentially amphibious.
So here's the story of Tangier Island. It is the water coming into it? Thank you, global warming. And at the same time, it is actually sinking. Is that not correct about this island? Talk to me about what the hell is going on here. This is truly a travesty. And I just want everybody to either go to Earl's website that has wonderful pictures or just Google Tangier Island. This truly is paradise. To lose this would really be sad. Talk to me.
Well, it's a paradise that you have to recalibrate your senses to appreciate to some extent. It's a very quiet kind of beauty that Tangier has. It's a marshland. It's got very few trees. It's a wafer of green hanging over the water. The highest point on the island is 5 feet above the tides. Most of the island very few places fail to or clear 3 feet. And the vast majority of the island, which is salt marsh, fails to clear 1. So it's a watery place. And since the 1850s, and this is borne out by maps, 1850 is really the only reason that date is used is because that's when we got our first kind of modern maps of the Chesapeake that can be compared accurately with today's maps, so that you can chart change. And since 1850, the island has lost 2/3 of its land mass, an average of more than 8 acres per year. And for many, many decades, this was ascribed solely to wind-driven erosion. The waves would roll in mostly from the west and just tear at the shore of Tangier. And in truth, there's a lot of what mariners call fetch between Tangier and the western shore, a lot of open water, room for waves to build, for the wind to whip waves up. And so even when it isn't storming, you've got water clawing at Tangier's peaty edges. Yeah, this is not a sandy island. This is a peaty sod in which marsh grass is rooted. And so when waves come in and they smack into the shore, they don't roll up it as you'd see waves do on a beach. They carve away big tumps of marshland and carry it off. And it doesn't come back. So since 1850, 2/3 of it has gone. And it's only been in relatively recent years, as awareness of climate change has come to the fore, that folks have really started to recognize that wind-driven erosion, while the main agent of Tangier's shrinkage, is directly tied to what's happening worldwide with global warming, with the rise of the seas, because with every little bit that water rises, the effects of those wind-driven waves is amplified, and that process is accelerating. So the wear is getting faster and faster as time goes on.
It's funny. It's not funny, but it's true. I live in Florida, and Miami Beach is on water half the time, and people don't understand that. I mean, if just the slightest little rain and boom, that's how high the sea has risen, and nobody wants to do anything about it, of course. I mean, it costs money. What are you going to do? La 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 la. And but that's a situation here where people's entire livelihood, first of all, living in one place for generations, this is all that they know. This is their world. You have to discuss the impact. I mean, there are some scenes in this book where, old graveyards are washing out to sea, for Christ's sakes. I mean, it's horrible. It's just horrid.
Well, it's terrifying. If you're from Tangier, it's existentially terrifying. As you say, they've been there for 9 generations now. And really, it's not like you can pick up and just move to the mainland. It's getting tough to sell a house on Tangier for obvious reasons. And so finding the money to get property elsewhere is elusive.
Right. Yeah. And then you have to think about what you do, because tourism may be a new way to make money, so to speak. But even that's difficult because it's remote. That's for sure. Yeah. How do you build to accommodate? I mean, these people's lives are just sinking into the ocean. Couldn't have this conversation without saying to you, we're having this conversation in the age of Trump, when the hawks are anti-science agenda, right? I was reading, by the way, Trump actually told the mayor of Tangier Island, I want to mention his name, Mayor James is it Oker? Uker
Uker.
Eskridge, that he shouldn't worry about the rise in sea levels. Trump said to him, this is a quote, "Your island has been there for 100 years, and I believe your island will be there for 100 more. I want to say to you, Earl, what, huh? Oh, please. And the people of the island support this dude? Talk to me."
Well, there's a backstory to Trump's call to Uker, and it's this, that in early June of 2017, CNN sent a crew out to Tangier, led by meteorologist Jennifer Gray, to put together a story on exactly kind of the paradox you just mentioned, that here you have an island that is succumbing to the effects of sea level rise, and it voted more than 87% for a president who believes climate change to be a hoax. So that was the thrust of the CNN story. And in the course of an interview that Jennifer Gray was conducting with several of the old-timers, Uker declared that he loved Trump as much as he loved members of his own family. So this aired later in that week on a Friday, and the very next Monday, Uker received a phone call from the White House. So there was there's a direct relationship between the CNN report airing and Trump making this call.
Of course, Trump doesn't watch CNN, but that's another conversation.
Yeah, well, that may be, but the word reached him somehow. And I think Islanders are absolutely unapologetic about their support for Trump. They remain very stridently his supporters. And I think that one of the reasons that they've kind of dug in their heels in that regard is that, I'm guessing here a little bit, but the response to that CNN report online was distressing. And I'm understating the case dramatically. The hundreds of people who wrote "Let 'em drown" or variations on that, I think Islanders were heartsick, alarmed, bewildered. They just couldn't understand how a political difference with someone would prompt that someone to wish them dead. And I have to share that bewilderment. It was a bad showing. And, that's just, it happens whenever a story about Tangier airs almost, that there's this whipsaw reaction. And I don't think that the reaction is representative of any particularly large group out there. I differ with Trump and my island friends on sea level rise. I think it's pretty irrefutable that it's happening, but I just can't understand how someone can react the way some of these folks have.
Yeah, I believe this is kind of off topic a little bit, but I will say that my theory on all of this is that there's something so sick in American society right now. And people are just so unmoored. We say that talking about an island. They're unmoored. They're confused. Yeah. And they lash out because it's easy to lash out where you don't have to, there are no consequences for what you write. But let me play devil's advocate, though, because there is Tangier's Island, and it's a remarkable place, and it's lovely, and it's romantic, and, it touches a part of all of our instinctual hearts, of what it is. But on the other hand, that's what it is. It's a 500 and something people and on this tiny little island in the middle of nowhere. Should the government rescue tiny little Tangier's Island or Miami Beach? I mean, you start to think, what's important, what's not. Not that this government is going to rescue anybody, but assuming we have a working government that does understand, the capacity of all this, there is a fair argument to make. Should it be saved?
Oh, I think there certainly is. There is a debate to be had, and we have to decide how to decide what we're going to have and what we're going to surrender to the sea, because we do not have the time, the means, or the technology to save every place that's going to be imperiled in the next few years. I mean, we have 88,000 miles of shoreline, and a significant percentage of it is going to be feeling the effects of climate change real personally. And what you see happening in Miami and in Norfolk and in New Orleans, that's going to be repeated in a town near you, and it's coming. So what Tangier forces us to do is to have this inconvenient debate, probably before we're ready to have it. But but not a moment too soon.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful point.
This is, it's not the best city to have the debate with. It's a tiny population. But what it does force us to say is, okay, is salvation going to be simply a function of head count? If so, places like Miami will fare just fine. I mean, there is an efficiency to saving Miami because you're saving millions, not 460. On the other hand, if that is your sole criteria, you're going to be giving up a lot of places that we have come to value as a nation. A lot of sacred ground that is not heavily populated. And so we've got to decide, okay, if it's not just head count, then what are the other factors that make a place worth saving? And how do we quantify the unquantifiable, really, in deciding what traits we want to keep, we want to preserve. And it's going to get ugly.
What's interesting here is first you have to get to convince many people that there is such a thing as global warming. So it's like, and it can't be first you have to do A in order to get B. I think all of this has to happen simultaneously, or it'll be too late, which is something that we need to address here, because how much time does Tangier really have to save itself? Or Miami Beach, for that matter. But we're talking Tangier. Does anybody know really what? I know you address it in the book, so just quickly, what's the answer to that question?
Well, I think that the scientific prediction is probably around 25 years, and that strikes me as probably pretty realistic if it's just the island's demise due to external forces that we're talking about. But there's another type of erosion underway, unfortunately, and that is that the population is suffering a demographic collapse, or such a collapse is looming, and it's not long before you'll see a great many older Tangiermen die, right. And
not much
those
left.
Numbers. Yeah, and on an island, unlike a small town on the mainland, when the grocery store closes in your town on the mainland, you get in the car and you drive 5 miles to the next town over and you go to the grocery store there. But on Tangier, if the grocery store closes, that's not an option. And it would be a very tough place to live without the sole little grocery store that it has. So you're going to see some tipping points kind of come into play in the next few years, I think, where some essential town services are no longer going to have the human critical mass necessary to keep them solvent, and then you've got a real emergency on your hands.
The existential question then remains: can the island be saved? Can Earth be saved, or have we crossed the Rubicon? I'm not sure people know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Well, I think if we were willing to act heroically, Tangier could be saved, but it's got to happen really, really soon. We can't sit on this. The forces at play are way ahead of us right now. We got to play catch up.
Wonderful book. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with journalist Earl Swift, the author of a beautiful, haunting, and important new book, Chesapeake Requiem, A Year with the Watermen of Vanishing Tangier Island. For more information about Mr. Swift and his book, visit earlswift.com. You are listening to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show. My guests today are Earl Swift, the author of Chesapeake Requiem, A Year with the Watermen of Vanishing Tangier Island, and Susan Hand Shatterly, the author of SEAWEED CHRONICLES, A World at the Water's Edge. The Halli Casser-Jayne Show posts new podcasts Wednesdays 3 p.m. Eastern at hallicasserjayne.com and is available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Be sure to find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can find the Halli Casser-Jayne Show on your Alexa device, too. Oh, and come play with me on Twitter at the Halli CJ Show. Beginning in her native Maine, then expanding to Canada, Wales, Japan, the Philippines, and beyond. Susan Hand Shatterly pulls back the curtain on the hidden world of seaweed. Did I say seaweed? Yes, that is correct. Seaweed is ancient and basic, a testament to the tenacious beginnings of life on Earth. And why wouldn't seaweed be a protein life source for the lives that have evolved since? Shatterly asks in her new book, Seaweed Chronicles, A World at the Water's Edge. Small in size and large in lyrical prose. Shatterly, the recipient of a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts and 2 grants from the Maine Arts Commission, explores all the wonders of the natural world anew through a richly informative and elegant storytelling. Through her own research and through interviews with marine biologists, conservationists, agriculturalists, and others, she offers a look into the extraordinary life cycle of seaweed, teaching readers about its role in local environments and its interconnected global significance. Shatterly also introduces us to the people and communities that depend on seaweed and how they are working to protect this critical natural resource, as traditional hand harvesting gives way to industrialized methods, and as chefs, scientists, and businesses recognize seaweed's wide-ranging applications. Shatterly examines the big questions of conservation that have come to light. What must remain wild for the health of the planet, and what can we responsibly take as we face climate change and diminishing natural resources? Note, it's almost impossible to go through a day without encountering seaweed somewhere in your life. Let's talk with the author of Seaweed Chronicles, Susan Hand Shatterly. Susan, I'm going to start with this with you. I just want to say this. We'll explore it later during the interview, but I live in Florida now.
You what?
I live in Florida. Beaches from Florida to South America, all over, have been plagued in recent years by these massive influxes of the sarcossum blooms, threatening our ecosystem. I mean, it's a nightmare down here. We really had a horrible time. Tourism, that's the jack of all trades here, and everything is connected. But then here we are. So let me put that out there. We're going to go back to that, but I wanted to give you a heads up. I'm going there in a little bit with you. So let's start with this. Let's you became fascinated with seaweed, and you write this absolutely charming book. Charming. I am highly recommending this. It is just a wonderful piece of prose, including facts and all of that. But so talk to me, why seaweed?
Well, actually, the truth of the matter is that I consider myself an essayist, although I've written many articles and children's books, but my books of essays are sort of define for me who I am. And I was reading my agent off a list of possible essays to be combined into a new book, and I noticed that she was especially quiet. And then I came to an essay, and I said I wanted to go out on the water with somebody I knew and cut seaweed with her. She was a seaweed harvester. And so my agent said to me, write a book about seaweed. And I said, there's just not that much to write about. Well, there is, actually.
Absolutely.
And all of a sudden, I began to take a look. But here's the interesting thing. 5 years ago, it took me 5 years to do this whole book. And 5 years ago, nobody was talking that much about seaweed. Now, it's even on the front page of the New York Times. It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
So I think my agent is a genius. I can't wait to ask her what she thinks my next book should be.
I can't wait either, actually, to tell you the truth. So tell me this, though. I mean, how in the hell did you research a project like this? I mean, it was so obscure 5 years ago. So talk to me a little bit about the research that went into this.
Well, first of all, I do live on the coast of Maine, and I have all my life written about the environment and about people working with wild species or wild places, but I didn't know anything about seaweed. And yet I knew a couple of key people to go to, and they're in the book. And I went from them to others that they suggested, and I began to go to these meetings about seaweed policy, and I realize now a couple of things. One is that our relationship with the ocean, we really have to get down to talking about policies. And, that's sometimes sitting around a table and being annoyed with each other because we disagree. But there's so much at stake with all our oceans now. But the people I met, I just fell in love with. And I hope you get that in the book because these were wonderful people who were so generous to me to teach me. I mean, they actually had to teach me, be my teachers. And in exchange, I wrote about them.
We're going to talk about them in a minute. I want to get to what seaweed is. I eat it. I mean, I eat it. I'm a big sushi eater. I'm a big, I've got actually some seaweed pieces right next to my desk here that I imbibe all day long. So that was one of the reasons.
Are you going to eat it as we talk?
No, I won't because I can't talk and eat at the same time. I can barely do anything at the same time besides talk. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think people understand what it is. Plant, algae, how many species? Give us background on what this seaweed stuff is.
Right. Well, it is algae, and it's called a macroalgae. The microalgae is the one-celled phytoplankton that floats in the ocean and also in fresh water. But and you may see in newspapers it says an algae bloom or something like that, but it doesn't tell you if it's microalgae, these one-celled things, or macroalgae, which is seaweed. And seaweed are among our first live things, and they also put out an enormous amount of oxygen into the water as well as microalgae. They both do that, and into the air. And what they do is they have something that almost looks like a plant, but it evolved totally differently. And it's a little holdfast that sticks them to the rocks, and then a lot of them have a stipe like a stem, and then a blade like leaves and flowers. But they work differently than plants do, and they're not as complicated.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking.
Yet they do something very interesting, I think, which is they absorb a lot of the minerals and things that are good for us that are in the ocean. But if they're growing in a polluted place, they will also absorb a lot of bad things for us. So it's very important if we're going to eat seaweed, to eat seaweed that grows in clean places.
Thousands and thousands of species, am I correct?
Yes. Here in the coast of Maine, we have 250 species we've identified. Over in Ireland, there are 500 species. I'm not sure why there's that big difference, but you're right, yes.
So you know what's interesting to me? Seaweed. Ubiquitous. Just everywhere. Wherever you go.
Right.
We've all gone to the coast. We've all seen seaweed. It's all over the place. We walk the beaches. It's all dead and rotting on the shores or whatever.
Right.
And yet it never has, gotten its due. It certainly is not the orchid of plants. That's for sure. I mean, right. But, why do they call it weed? Sea is such a beautiful word.
Well, I think it's a mistake.
Yeah. Let's talk about that.
Because, first of all, it's not a weed because it's not a plant. And second of all, people who are using it for food now always refer to it as a sea vegetable or sea vegetables because they want to take it away from the idea of a weed, which is incorrect on two points. One is it's really invaluable. It's not something you rip up and throw away. And the second thing is it's not a plant.
Has a very interesting life cycle?
It does. And complicated. Very complicated. Well, did you just say tell me about it?
Yeah.
I didn't hear you.
Yeah, I did.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Give us a little background on it.
Okay. Well, let's see if I can do that. What it does is most seaweeds, but not all, have two stages. One is the spore stage, and the other is the gamete stage, in other words, the sexual stage. And what they do, whether they're spores or they're eggs and sperm, is just flow those into the water all at once, all the same species at once, during a certain time of year. And each seaweed species would be different. And those little tiny microscopic things do find each other. And some of the reasons they do is because sometimes the eggs have pheromones. And another technique that some seaweeds use is the eggs sink immediately to the bottom of the water. And so they're not being pushed around by the waves so much, and they can find each other more easily there. Then they settle down, and they're very, very tiny. And they have something wonderful called a holdfast, and it looks a little bit like the beginning of roots, but it doesn't suck up moisture the way roots do. It just anchors the seaweed. And all the activity that the seaweed does with making sunlight into food is done in each cell all over the plant. So they're rather
sexy.
magical.
It's sexy and magical.
They are kind of sexy. and the other thing is, actually, here's the surprising thing, they're beautiful.
Right.
I mean, if you stop slipping on them, and take one and put it in the water and let the sun shine on it, they usually have beautiful shapes and colors. Well, I think so at this point.
I agree with you. I totally agree with you. And, if you have tropical fish tanks and you put them in, I mean, they are one of the wonderful backdrops to that. And those are probably the most simplistic of the, species that you probably get for those things. I want to go back to the CO2 thing because this show, which you don't know, is really based on, we're talking about climate change and pollution and all of those things. And the subject near and dear to my heart, and I'm just frosted about how this administration is just setting us back thousands of years. But I'm saying that you're not involved. But we need this CO2 thing, this cleaning up the air, these plants that can clean up this poor ocean that is hurting so badly at this point. I just want to punctuate the value of seaweed on that level, because we're seaweed as a food certainly is the new nutrient, but just again, let's punctuate the CO2 issues and the cleaning up of our poor dear oceans.
Our poor dear oceans. Yes. I have a quote from a wonderful man I interviewed, and it's in the book, and he said, I love this. I mean, it hurts, but I love it. We don't know how to assess the value of species within their ecological communities, so we tend to think of them as worthless rather than priceless.
Oh, wow.
And here's the thing. Yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah.
Here's the thing. I am waiting to find out how we can all unite, those of us who are worried about issues about CO2 and global warming and climate change. And we along the Gulf of Maine are very worried about the change in the regime of the water currents in the Gulf of Maine. I mean, that's scary because that has a lot to do with everything, all the health in the Gulf. But yes, it's true that harvesters, they're doing experiments with seaweed aquaculture. And they are finding out that seaweed, when it's growing, when it's young and growing, will in fact suck up a lot of CO2. And then, it reaches its peak growth and it starts to degrade a little. Well, if they pick it before that and reseed the ropes, it'll happen again. The new ones will continue to take the CO2 out of that particular small circle of water that they're in. So in a way, this is a perfect aquaculture project because it doesn't pollute and it cleans.
There you go. And living in Florida, I don't have to tell you, we're really being affected just like the coast of Maine is. We've got to do something differently than what we've been doing and start to celebrate some of these natural wonders, that we have.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's why I wrote the book.
Right.
Actually.
Yeah, no, I get that. In the world in which our natural resources are being used up at an extraordinary pace, this algae is a rich source with what appears to be unending uses, which that fascinated me. Who knew it was in my lipstick? Right? So we think of seaweed, and we think of food. It's such a powerful nutrient. And the fact is, the Japanese eat more seaweed, and they have one of the highest life expectancies. Is that true?
Yeah. Yes, it's supposed to, but but there's a caveat here, and that is, yes, they're extremely healthy, much more than we are, and they eat seaweed. Now, their seaweed around their shores has a lot of iodine in it, but they also eat a lot of vegetables in the cabbage family, and they eat tofu. And both soybeans and cabbage family vegetables do absorb that iodine. So in other words, it's self-regulating. And it's so interesting that they have a tradition of eating these things, and it evolved, and they all kind of measure each other out, all these different foods. I just think that's wonderful to think about.
Right. So if we were to adapt it, you're saying, into our diet, then we also have to adopt our diet.
Well, no, because a lot of the cooks and a lot of people who are interested in seaweeds for the nutrient density here in this country don't eat the way the Japanese do, and that's fine. I mean, there are people who put a few squares of kelp into their baked beans. There are people who put some seaweed into their salads. I mean, a little every day is excellent for you.
A little goes a long way.
You don't have to.
Right.
You don't have to eat a whole ton of seaweed. No.
Actually, it's an acquired taste. I remember the first time that I had it, I thought, oh my God! But now I love it. So go figure. Your palate kind of adjusts along the way. And I'm talking about outside of sushi, because I'm a sushi eater.
Right.
Right. But there you go. So I mentioned lipstick. Where else do we find seaweed being incorporated into our corporate world, if you will?
Well, here's an interesting thing, is that I remember being out in Nebraska about 10 years ago and seeing those big combines on the soybean and corn fields. And there was a little wind up, and the topsoil was blowing up around the combine. I mean, it would have to do that, really. There are big industrial companies that are harvesting, and it's a whole industrial kind of enterprise rather than an independent person harvesting for food. But they harvest a kind of seaweed that here in the Gulf of Maine grows closest to shore, and they dry it and they grind it up, and it is taken out to the Midwest and spread on the fields to make them actually healthier. But the question is, because seaweeds do such an excellent job here protecting and also feeding a variety of life from tiny isopods to fish, should we really be taking it out to the Midwest? Is there some other way to do this?
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that that's a conversation well worth having. And in fact, with my other guest, that is part of our conversation, because you have to really measure how you're playing with the ecosystem.
Yeah.
What you're stripping away from A may be detrimental to B. It's a very complicated world we're living in. That is for sure.
It's very complicated.
Yeah. And it's not, it's between the politics and the science and the nutrition and the business world, and there's so much. It's a wonder we're out of balance. It's way far too much, I think, for a lot of people to address in a measured measured way these days. Living on the coast, I mean, one of the things you talk about is its function in local communities. I mean, it's a global thing. But I love this. I'm on a kick right now that I think that we all need to get back to basics, get more involved on a local level, local news, going out, getting off the internet, as you and I speak on the internet. It's true. And it's a hard thing. But when you find sources or new resources to generate financial aid in a way to local small towns in America, be they coastal or whatever. I mean, that always is something that I like to hear about. Talk to me about that in terms of seaweed. Is there an important conversation to have here?
Oh, absolutely. I have in my book, I talk about Dr. Brian Beal, for instance, who works in the poorest county, one of the most beautiful counties on the coast of Maine. And he has dedicated his life to try to come up with new ways to harvest from the sea after we've depleted our fisheries. And he raises shellfish. And when you raise shellfish, you do come into contact with seaweed. Here, because we have an invasive species of crab that is eating our flats empty, and also because seaweed, when it begins to disintegrate, does feed phytoplankton and other very small things that the clams and mussels and other shellfish use as food. So it's all entwined. And I'm very touched by his commitment to place. He could have gone anywhere, and he stays right here where he grew up, and he works very, very hard to bring back clamming, to figure out how to raise clams and mussels and oysters in clean aquaculture sites. And there are other people I've met. I mean, the people who are harvesting the kelps out on the deeper water than right along the shore, they are so committed to doing it carefully. They're independent harvesters, and it's just wonderful to be out with them. They take care of their resource. I mean, there are a lot of people who are doing good. I just think that somehow, at some point, this has to make some kind of a difference. I don't mean just the people who are doing good in seaweed. People are doing good things and care a lot. But we read the news an awful lot, and, then we have to put our head under the comforter.
That's so true. That's so true. No, it is true. It's absolutely true. I think one of the things, though, is it seems like it's on such a small scale when you think of the global impact of all of this crazy that we've done to the environment and done to our seas and our this, that, and the other thing. There is then another part of the conversation, this interconnected global significance. I think what I read in your book, 35 countries are involved in seaweed production. I mean, it's big business to boot. And when it gets to that level, then you get into some weird stuff with people trying to get along.
Well, we may be getting into weird stuff here. I mean, the people who are experimenting with agriculture along this coast and cutting carefully and trying to preserve the clam flats, all these people, their lives are here. I mean, it's not just for a year or so. But it is true that the federal government is giving gazillions of dollars to different universities, different places, to see if we can offshore raise kelps for biofuels. And those are going to be huge platforms, small cities, if they ever come about.
Yeah, and then you get into that too. There's it's all so complex and irritating on one level, and yet possibilities are endless, and that's a positive thing. So many of our natural resources are endangered, and certainly our fish supplies have been depleted. In the community where I am, which is South Central Florida, East Coast, we used to be able to just go to the beach and on the Indian River, which is the intercoastal up here. And just get oysters as much as you want. Oh, well, not so much anymore. You know, same thing with clamming. Clamming was a big thing here. The river, you know, what I talked about in the beginning of the show, all our inland waterways are just, you know, got this horrible red algae growing all over the place. It's enough to make you crazy. And nobody wants to do anything about it because it's Big Sugar is running the show up here, and all this is probably a result of that, or governors who, you know, don't want to take money from the federal government because that's what they're built their careers on. Yeah.
Well, but I did write about that in my book, and it is a huge problem, and it does have to do with too many nutrients leaking into the water in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And interestingly, the Amazon River, I can't remember how many thousands of miles of waterway it actually ushers to the sea. But because there's so many farms and cattle farms and new little towns and everything just springing up all over, the nutrient load is huge. And it comes out into the Atlantic, and then it starts up the coast and pours into the Caribbean and into the into the Gulf of Maine. And those islands should be cleaning up their own acts. But, you know, as you said, has to be an international effort, really. I mean, we can work here on the coast of Maine and all as hard as we can. But these are different countries that have to work together because this can be stopped, and it can be done in a way that's not cruel to people who want to make a livelihood with gardens or with cows, you know. But it has to be a cooperative effort, and you're right. I don't know how much of that's going on.
Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting what people put as priorities. And I think, right, you know, if you can't eat and you can't breathe, it seems to me, then what's the story?
Right.
And if you're a father and a mother and a grandparent, and you see what's going on, you can't have been on this earth as long as I have and not see the difference in the quality of the air and the smell of the air, or how things grow, or how the seasons change or don't change anymore. So you get into that. So it's priority, you know. And we live in a world where people. I was going to say, Susan, we live in a world today where people don't care about anything. People in power don't care about people. They care about what works for them and keeping them in power. And until that shift comes, I don't know how we got to be those kind of people, but until that shift comes, we're in deep gaga. You were going to say...
I was going to say. Well, here's what. Because we have to get up every morning and go about our day, what I prefer to be, although I get very angry, I make the mistake of reading the New York Times early in the morning, and it takes a while to calm down. But you're right, we may lose the battle. But, you know, more people are turning to good ways of doing things. I mean, I live in a rural place. I see young people in their 30s and early 40s starting organic farms here, selling to their neighbors, doing things right, you know, and I see them actually very political and very much stepping up to the plate as far as what they think is right. And if we lose the fight, at least we're going to be on the right side, it seems to me.
I think it's also a question of where you live. And Maine and New Hampshire, all, you know, and Vermont. I mean, you guys up there just have such a wonderful sense of things. I don't think that's true when you go down the coast to places like Florida, which was once one of the most beautiful states in the world, and it is now just, you know, wall-to-wall crap. I mean, they've just destroyed this place, you know, for the good dollar. And I don't. And can it be saved? I think it's beyond being saved, personally. But that's.
I think that Florida has been so beautiful. I remember it way in the past. I haven't been there in about 25 years, but
you'd cry. You'd cry. You just cry. They just took one of the most beautiful places in the world and just turned it into Brooklyn. But such is the way it goes. There's still pockets here, thank goodness, but that's changing quickly as well. I was going to ask you as our last question, and you may have already answered it. How are you feeling about the future of all of this? Hopeful or hell-filled? And I think that you sound like you're pretty hopeful that we can pull it together.
I try to be hopeful. It doesn't always succeed.
I've been speaking with Susan Hand Shatterly. Her book is Seaweed Chronicles, A World at the Water's Edge. For more information about Susan and her work, visit her website at susanhandshatterly.com. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Halli Casser-Jayne Show, a production of RESEC LLC. Be sure to tune in Wednesdays, 3 p.m. Eastern, when new podcasts are posted at hallicasserjayne.com and on all your favorite apps. We are open 24/7. So, until next time, when we meet again, this is Halli Casser-Jayne.